See, we're only on the second law of thermodynamics. Careful examination proves out who God is, that there is a God. The second law applies to life forms, thus ruling out evolution. If you got no evolution, you got a creator, God. Information degenerates, deteriorates according to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, to produce a living organism like a properly functioning eye, you must have extra energy. But you need more than that. That's an insufficient answer. Now we're told that you have extra energy from the sun. We grant that. But there's another question. The other requirement is information. While energy comes from the sun, I ask, where does the information come from? Energy plus information. But some claim that the information came from the sun along with the energy. Now, I don't know of information, certainly not the kind of information that would define the human eye riding on sunbeams. Where's the information from for hemoglobin, or the information for that simplest cell equivalent to thousands of copies of Encyclopedia Britannica on a sunbeam from the sun? Information doesn't come on sunbeams. They talk, these greatest scientists, they conclude the greatest things that actually support creation. And then they turn around, in order to undo that, they say the dumbest things. Naturally, information deteriorates. Yet we see tremendous amounts of information even in the simplest cell. How did it get there? Consider the statement by Harold Blum in his book, Time's Arrow and Evolution. He says, no matter how carefully we examine the energies of living systems, we find no evidence of defeat of thermodynamic principles. But we do encounter a degree of complexity not witnessed in the non-living world. In other words, it applies to life just as well as non-life. Hey, how about a creator, a designer? The only difference is that when we get to living systems, we find that which is more complex, but it follows the same laws of thermodynamics. Compare a quotation from Dr. Patton's notes by Ilya Pirogogin. He's a Nobel laureate. Unfortunately, this principle cannot explain the formation of biological structures. The probability that at ordinary temperatures, a macroscopic number of molecules is assembled to give rise to the highly ordered structures and to the coordinated functions characterizing living organisms is vanishingly small. The idea of spontaneous genesis of life in its present form is thereby highly improbable, even on the scale of billions of years during which prebiotic evolution occurred. So there's not enough room for billions of years, because if the universe was more than 10,000 years old, life on Earth never would have existed, because we go back 10,000 years and the sun would have been too hot to permit life to exist on the Earth. Sidney Fox, talking about the origin of life, states, evolution, however, has put together the smallest components. It has proceeded from the simple to the complex. Yeah, well, fairy tales. Chemical and engineering news. Now, he is one of the leading experts in the world on the origin of life. Obviously, in order to get this simple cell with information content equivalent to thousands of copies of the sets of encyclopedias, you've got to have a procedure from the simple to the complex. And yet, in terms of information content, we know that the second law says it goes the other way. So you get the sludge, it's going to get less than sludge. But to get that simple cell, Sidney Fox says you've got to proceed the other way. Well, how do you do that naturally? You've got extra energy from the sun, but where does that extra information come from? From natural processes? It's impossible. We see illustration of this second law of thermodynamics throughout the living world, whether we are looking at the simplest cell or whether we are looking at anything else in the universe. Consider the statement that's made by Theodosius Dobansky, as he illustrates in the living world the implications of this second law. Here he is talking about mutations, which ironically are supposed to be the explanations of the onward and upward process of evolution. He says, the harmfulness of most mutants is just what could be reasonably expected. Wow. So how did sludge get to humans? In other words, here is something that goes wrong and produces harm. So how did sludge get to humans? An accident, he says, a random change in any delicate mechanism can hardly be expected to improve it. He says poking a stick into the machinery of one's watch or into one's radio set can hardly be expected to make it work better. No, we have random change that sometimes occurs in the hereditary process that's defined as a mutation. It produces harm. It produces onward. It doesn't produce onward and upward processes, as he would imply from this statement. He continues defining this phenomenon, saying, one can say that mutations are owing to incorrect copying, to occasional mistakes in the generally so remarkable accurate process of replication. You may, if you wish, compare mutations to accidental misspellings or misprints, which even the most experienced copyist makes from time to time. Information? Yes. And it's deteriorating, not increasing. So Theodosius Dohansky, Heredity and the Nature of Man. Okay. So, mutations that are supposed to be the raw material from which we get this procedure upward to produce evolution. But what did Theodosius say? Interrupted by a phone call from LaRue. Yes. Anyway, great phone call. Good to have a good friend. So we're going to meet, and we're going to go out to the end of the green line and discuss theology. Maybe somebody will argue with us. So, mutations then are supposed to be the raw material from which we get this procedure upward to produce evolution. And yet, it's rather better described as an illustration of this second law in the living processes that produces deterioration and disorder and disorganization, 3 Ds. That's what the law predicts, and that's what we observe. These great scientists turn around and make these great conclusions about evolution from nothing, and then they turn around and tell us the reason why our conclusions are wrong is that we have magic on our side. Stephen Gould has acknowledged that that's what we see indicated in the fossil record about the history of life in this world. He says, I'll say it once more, maximal diversity of structural design right at the beginning, with the late history of life being a story of reduction of the initial maximal diversity by the extinction and loss of most of the lineage and failure of any survivors. We're talking about species deteriorating, numbers down, not up, ever again to generate fundamental new designs. Wow, how does that happen? You got to be, I don't know what, you got to be thinking. Stephen Gould, in his speech at SMU, at the beginning of the history of life, we have every major design right from the start. And from that point, you don't get an increase in complexity. You don't get increasing order. You have, as he said, a reduction through extinction and a failure ever again, he says, to generate new designs. And yet he's one of the top ones in his day of evolution. You have fewer phyla, fewer major organizational structural designs now than you had at the beginning, and is deteriorated and degenerated according to the principle of entropy. Compare with quotation from Dr. Patton's notes. Jean Rostand. No, decidedly I cannot make myself think that these slips, meaning mutations, of heredity have been able, even with the cooperation of natural selection, which doesn't exist, even with the advantage of the immense periods of time in which evolution works on life, to build the entire world with its structural prodigality and refinements, its astounding adaptations. I cannot persuade myself to think that the eye, the ear, the human brain have been formed in this way. And yet he's an advocate of that very thing. We're reminded that the evolutionist represents his kind of change typically as a change from the small to the large. We look at time-life's representation of the evolution of man and begin with the small monkey-like creature, the gibbon, which they acknowledge has nothing to do with the evolution of man. But he's in the chart. That leads them to the larger and still larger. Finally, on up to the tallest, a modern man. You look at the biology textbook and you see a little Eopius, the horse, leading up to the next size, and then the next size, and finally up to the modern horse of today. And if evolution is true, then this is the kind of thing that we would see represented in the fossil record. But this is not the case. I've seen pictures. Actually, the oldest, largest horse is first, and then a medium-sized horse. The second law of thermodynamics predicts a downward, deteriorative procedure that we see illustrated. And what we do actually see in a fossil record is perfectly consistent with that second law. Notice the statement that's made in the geology text that's made by von Engelen and Castor regarding the nature of life in the past. He says that mammalian life was richer in kinds, of larger sizes, and had a more abundant expression in the Pliocene, if there's so-called things, but it's not, than in the later times. Entropy. They say these things, they don't even realize what they're saying, refuting their own theology. Von Engelen and Castor says it was bigger in the past, and there were more kinds. There are fewer kinds today. This reminds us of Gould's statement that when we begin, we had all of the major kinds. We haven't produced any new ones since, and where's evolution? And it has deteriorated since then. How can these people say this over and over and over again? Things are going more and more complex. We have more species, and yet they say the same opposite elsewhere. And it's deteriorated since then, and that's true also regarding size. Consider the statement in Time magazine regarding Richard Leakey's work in Africa. It says that Leakey has been scouring the gorge since 1931. Over the ages, he has unearthed the bones of an ancient pig as big as a rhino, and a 6-foot-tall sheep, and a 12-foot-tall bird, and the flat-topped skull of the erect nutcracker man. Wow. Modern-day man, right? Walking around in a tuxedo. No, nutcracker man. That's a nut job. There are things that were bigger, sheep and birds and rhinos, and that's just scratching the surface. That's typical of what we find in the fossil record, rather than the other way around, which is the way it is generally represented. The horse chart, showing an increase in size, is in virtually every biology textbook. But we see a donkey, Equus gigantus, that was unearthed near Lubbock, Texas, and that was a donkey that would have been about 9 feet tall at the shoulder. That certainly would mess the horse charts, and so they conveniently leave that out. And so they do most of the information on relative size. A bison in the past that would have been about 12 feet tall at the shoulder, that has a horn span of about 12 feet, much, much larger than the bison that we observe today. Again, you don't see that in the charts that are represented in the textbooks. In the fossil record, the armadillo was much larger, in fact 9 times larger than the present-day armadillo. And when we look at the various creatures in the fossil record, invariably they were larger in the past. We see a fossil turtle that was found in San Antonio, almost identical to modern-day turtles, except that this one was 12 to 14 feet across. We look at crocodiles as they appear in the fossil record, compared with the modern crocodile. The fossil crocodile was some 50 feet long, compared with today's crocodile of about 14 feet long. This is typical of the fossil record. Most of us are used to cattails around the countryside. In the fossil record, they were over 60 feet tall. A cattail, the cone being somewhere between 6 and 10 feet. And this is a very common fossil that we see everywhere. A dragonfly fossil with a wingspan of over 30 inches. That's typical of the fossils that you find in the fossil record. That's not an exception. Consider the statement of Clifford Seemack in his Trilobite, Dinosaur and Man. He says, in general, all the Pennsylvanian insects were larger than the ones we know today. Now, if things are evolving, as in these little charts that we see in the biology text, then why aren't they bigger today than they were in the past? In fact, the truth of the matter is just the opposite. That's true with every living thing that we find that's analogous to things alive today. If they have a modern representation, we see that they're bigger in the past. We find some rhinos in the fossil record were up to 18 feet tall. 18. Notice also the camel that was found in India, 20 feet tall in the fossil record. How big were humans? One of the more dramatic fossils that we find is on a wolf, which was approximately 6 feet tall at the shoulder. We see a 14-foot modern shark compared with a fossil shark up to 100 feet long. The dinosaurs, of course, were huge creatures. They're extinct today, virtually. We do have one modern representation of the dinosaurs in South America, the Tutara. He's about 8 inches long. Wow, that's huge. In the living world, when we look at the fossil record, we see things